Good evening and welcome to another edition of Prompt Response. I am your host, Ryan Ozzie Smith, voted #1 creamiest voice on Twitch 3 years running. I'm a voice actor and Twitch streamer. You can find me on Twitch by searching Aussie Man Plays. I am also your host for tonight's reading, Tomato Leaf Tea, the third chapter from the Bram Stoker Award finalist book, Bittersweets, by Angela Yuriko Smith. This story does have some elements of self-harm, graphic violence, and suicide. So if these are things you would rather not listen to, now is your time to click out. Prompt Response is sponsored by Authortunities, a weekly calendar of author opportunities for busy writers who need to know who, how much, and when is the deadline on Substack. You can subscribe at authortunities.substack.com. or follow the links in the description. In the last chapter, we met Stella and John, a young couple willing to demonstrate their love by actually dying for each other. They had everything they needed for a romantic evening of passion, except maybe the passion. Let's see who'll be visiting the Bittersweets next. If you'd like to read along, the book is available to read on Kindle Unlimited. Links in the description. Chapter 3 Tomato Leaf Tea. The old woman shambled halfway across the lobby without the receptionist hearing her. Upon reaching the counter, the old woman leaned forward, squinting at the girl's name tag. "Asriel," she said, "can you help me?" The receptionist had noted the woman's approach by now, and had watched her slow, stiff approach. Her hand rested on the name she had just written in the hotel's registry. "Of course," she said. "You must be my 2 o'clock client. Maeve, we have a nostalgic death waiting for you. Welcome to the Bittersweets." The old woman blinked, surprised, and then smiled. Her look was soft, but the light didn't reach her eyes. They were full of sad shadows. She nodded. "I have my things prepared, as instructed," she said. She held up a small satchel. "Here's my change of clothes in case I need them. And I paid online." "How set are you on poisoning your tomato leaf tea?" asked Asriel. "Tomato greens aren't really poisonous. That's a myth, so we had to supplement the toxin. Is that okay? It will be tomato leaf blend." Maeve shook her head. "If I was after accuracy in death, I wouldn't have paid for the nostalgia," she said. "When I was little, my mother always threatened that she would make me drink tomato leaf tea if I was bad." Asriel raised her eyebrows, questioning, but Maeve said no more. The afternoon sun shone through the lobby's glass door, causing Maeve's thinning white hair to glow lightly around her lined face. The two women locked gazes, studying each other. The old woman's eyes were pale and washed out, a faded mirror of the receptionist's sky blue. They had nothing in common except gender, but an understanding passed between them. "You know, death won't change the past," said Asriel. "It may not even change how you feel about it." "But it may, and that's all I need," said Maeve. "I'm ready when you are." The receptionist finished the rest of the check-in process with the old woman and walked her to the elevator, placing a keycard in her palm and pushing the buttons for her. "I hope you find the change you seek," she said, backing out as the elevator doors slid shut, parting the two women. Down the elevator went, taking Maeve into the basement levels. She exited the elevator on the 0.03rd floor, beneath the city surface. As she stepped out, she imagined she could feel the vibrations of the city trains in the walls. There were so many people in the world now, she mused. Every inch of the earth felt packed, above the surface and below. She stepped out of the elevator and looked down at her keycard for the first time. Number .022. The sign in front of the elevator directed her to go right, and she quickly found her door. She looked down the hallway, noting the worn green carpet and vintage wallpaper. It reminded her of her grandmother's dining room, all heavy velvet scrolls and leaves. She wondered if it was an intentional decorating choice or an oversight from the past. A carved wooden chair with golden velvet upholstery sat halfway down the hall against the wall. "This floor must be for the old people," she thought. "There's even places to rest as we hobble slowly along our way." Maeve wasn't happy about getting old. She wasn't happy about many things that had happened in her life, but she handled age like she had the rest of it. Fixed what she could and moved on. She had never tried a recreational death as it was a recently new fad, but she hoped it would bring her peace. It took her 3 tries to get the keycard to work. Her hands trembled lightly and her fingers had difficulty maneuvering the card in the reader. When she finally got the key to work, she pushed through as quickly as she could before it locked on her again, dropping her bundle in the process. She groaned as she bent over to retrieve it, not because anything hurt, but by habit. Maeve walked into the room and set her things on the crocheted popcorn bedspread. The room had the same worn feel as the hallway. A heavily draped window let in the late afternoon light, peeking around its curtained edges. The furniture, while in good condition, probably had to be purchased from antique shops. It was all from before her time, a fact she might mention in her review afterwards. This wasn't her era, but a few generations before. She walked to the window, curious to see what kind of view waited 3 floors below ground. Pulling back the drapes, she was surprised to see the street she had lived on as a girl. She knew it was just a projection from the address she had submitted, but the effect was instant. Her eyes stung as she took in the suburban landscape with its wide, sun-baked sidewalks and squat, ugly houses. She had hated how that neighborhood looked. Like the residents, every house conformed to an unspoken and boring standard. When a German lady had moved in, she broke the code by planting a vegetable garden in her front yard, ensuring herself as the topic of gossip for the next decade. Even the children, Maeve included, had participated in the whispers. They had all been cruel. She shook her head to clear it of the memories, and then chuckled at the irony. Memories are what she had paid extra for. A chair and a side table sat before the window, turned to face the pretend street of her past. An electric kettle waited with a teacup and saucer. On the saucer were 2 tea bags, each in a paper envelope. Printed on the paper were the words "tomato leaf tea, courtesy of the bittersweets." If only her mother could have seen her now, acting on the long-ago threat. "Bring it on, Mama." She turned the kettle on. As a girl, she'd always taken the threat seriously. Because of it, she'd never liked tea, suspicious that it would be laced with herbal toxins. As an adult, she knew her mother hadn't been serious and would have never hurt her only child, not physically anyway. Sometimes the worst damage hides underneath the skin, bruising the heart. Maeve never forgave her mother for sending her to live with her grandparents. When Maeve was in her gawky preteens, a new man had come into her mother's life, one who didn't appreciate a mouthy tomboy giving him the stink eye. Her mother had agreed to send Maeve away for the summer. But when the holidays ended, Maeve was registered by her grandmother in a new school. She had always felt temporary in her grandmother's home, so she never bothered making friends. When she graduated, no one had come to congratulate her. Her grandmother was ill, her grandfather had passed away, and her mother had simply forgotten. Maeve never called her to ask why. She had just moved on. After the ceremony, she walked through the high school parking lot alone, as families embraced. She didn't hear from her mother again for years, but her mother was alone and suddenly needed her. Her mother had gone terminal. Maeve had her own life by then, and there had been no room for her mother. She did her minimum duty as a daughter and had arranged for her mother to be transferred to a hospice facility, set up an automatic transfer for the fees, and continued with her life, intending to visit someday. Her mother passed in less than 6 months. Maeve had meant to let her mother stay there alone and unloved as punishment for her own desertion, she realized now. But Maeve had intended to eventually visit. Her procrastination had ruined her last chance to know her mother. The guilt had colored her life since. The electric kettle started whistling, cutting through Maeve's thoughts with a shrill cry. She hobbled to the kettle, opened a tea bag, and dropped it in the cup. The other she put in her pocket. As she poured the hot water, she wondered what she was trying to accomplish by playing with death. It didn't really matter now. She'd already paid for this. She would figure it out, or she wouldn't. She took her teacup and saucer to the chair and sat down. Her eyes stared at the fabricated suburban scene in front of her, but the street she saw was in her mind many years ago. She'd hated how the houses looked, but she had friends in that place. There had been at least 2 children in every house, and a lot of them had formed a complicated hierarchy of relationships. She hadn't been the most popular, but she'd always had the best ideas for adventures and games, ensuring her place at the center of things. She sipped the tea, leaving a tea bag to continue steeping. The tea was bitter and strong. She flipped over the tea's envelope and read the ingredients. Contains tomato leaves, acetonite, hemlock, and belladonna berry juice. Her hand shook a little more than usual, she noticed, as she dropped the paper on the side table. She swallowed the rest of the bitter brew quickly, burning her tongue, and glancing around the room to find where the resuscitation crew would be waiting. Against the opposite wall, she noticed a large mirror next to the door. Maeve quickly averted her eyes in case it were rude to look at them. The room seemed to be getting darker, as if a cloth shroud was being drawn around her eyes, closing her vision and dimming the light. Her thoughts diminished and rattled around in her head, then suddenly became too large and they were lost in the extra space. She set the cup of tea on the side table. "I'm doing this for you, Mama," she whispered. "I shouldn't have let you die alone. I should have forgiven you. I was bad, so I drank my tea." Her thoughts were congealing, moving like cold honey. She looked up towards the faux scene of her childhood, barely visible through the grey fog drifting over her sight. Her limbs felt cold and heavy. She wasn't getting up from this chair anytime soon. It was time for a sleep. "Forgive me," she whispered. Maeve felt her heart turn to stone in her chest. Then it ceased. When the resuscitation crew came in, they were subdued. This time were no rude jokes at the expense of the recently deceased. They gently laid the old woman out, mindful of her delicate, papery skin, as they injected her system with the healing nanos. When Maeve came back to herself, it was quietly. She simply inhaled and opened her eyes. She barely spoke, answering the questions they asked without volunteering conversation. She thanked each of them before she left, promising to leave them each a generous tip at the front desk on her way out. She refused their offering to escort her, saying she preferred solitude to sort her thoughts. Asriel was still at the desk when Maeve arrived back at the lobby. The old woman busied herself with making sure each technician was given a tip, and she insisted that Asriel also receive a gratuity. "Did you find that death resolved anything for you?" asked Asriel. Maeve shook her head no. "I guess I didn't really expect it to," she said. "But I had hoped. I wasted all my chances long ago." Asriel looked genuinely pained for her elderly client. We can only have so many second chances during life, said Azrael. Even here there's a limit. Maeve took the young girl's hand and kissed it as her eyes teared up. Goodbye, dear. Maeve had her return trip already arranged and waiting. She climbed into the car quietly and spoke not a word during the trip. Upon arrival, she thanked the driver and paid, including a generous tip for him as well. She took the elevator up to her tiny apartment and went inside. Leaving the lights off, she set down her tiny bundle of spare clothes, unused, and looked out of her window. This scene, she knew, was real. Her apartment window looked out on more windows, a wall of lit rectangles, set in the building next to hers. Behind each window, she realized, was a stranger. They all lived so close. Were they not divided by brick and glass, they could probably touch fingertips across the expanse. Sometimes they saw each other through the open blinds, eyes meeting briefly before their gazes averted. Despite their physical proximity, they were still strangers. Maeve realized that was her fault as much as theirs. Somebody had to say hello first, she thought. Somebody had to forgive first. Maeve went to her tiny kitchen and poured herself a mug of hot water from the tap. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her second tea bag. She didn't need to read the ingredients on the back this time. She knew it would do. She sat down with her mug of hot water and popped in her tea bag, letting it steep while she watched the windows of her nameless neighbors. Someone has to love first, she said to the empty room. It could have been me. Maeve drank her tea, slowly, as the evening closed in. And that concludes our story for today. I'm sorry it was a bit of a tearjerker. I hope you've enjoyed this reading of the Bram Stoker Award finalist book, Bittersweets, by Angela Yuriko Smith. I am Ryan Ozzie Smith, and it has been a pleasure to be your host tonight. If you'd like to connect with me, join me on Twitch by searching Aussie Man Plays or clicking the link in the description.